People don't quit jobs. They quit managers, especially when that manager is one of the 5 most toxic bosses that I'm exposing in this video. Knowing who they are is going to help you spot them, deal with them, and most importantly, escape them. And if you're dealing with number 5, you need to escape ASAP. You are almost guaranteed to encounter the first toxic boss in your career, Neil the Nepo Boss. I worked with so many Neils, but the first one really exemplified all Nepo bosses out there. Neil had gotten a job at the company because one of his parents was an executive at the organization. Now, on the surface, I don't think it's awful when a connection helps you get a job. In fact, that's how most people get jobs in the first place. The referral gets them the interview, and then their qualifications get them the job offer. But that's not the case for Neil. He was hired because his boss's boss's boss reported to his parent. Once hired, Neil didn't do his actual job. However, since performance has the least impact on promotions, he got fast-track promotions. The thing is, Neil thought he got there on merit. He was either ignorant or oblivious to the fact that strings were being pulled for him. Neil wasn't just the benefactor of the favoritism and visibility that nepotism bestowed on him. He also became a purveyor in it. I don't think Neil was malicious. I don't think most Neils are. But there are 2 dynamics that make them toxic. First, the work still needs to get done. Results require work, and you know Neil and his faves are not having any part of that. And there is one leadership skill that's really crucial that Neil has been socialized to do: delegate, but like to the extreme. He dumps his work on you. His favorites dump their work on you. And if you don't do it, you're the problem. Since Neil controls your performance review, pay increases, and promotion paths, failure to comply is going to cost you. The second thing that makes Neil so toxic is subtler, but it truly is what makes him a toxic manager. At every juncture of his life, Neil has started on third base. He has benefited from connections, money, and influence that he inherited, not earned. He deeply believes he deserves everything that has been handed to him, including promotions, pay increases, and praise. Neil has confused his mediocrity for meritocracy. A manager I had very early in my career was the first that I heard to use the term meritocracy in a corporate setting. Actually, it's what convinced me to take that job offer. Very quickly in the role, I established myself at the top of the proverbial leaderboard, only to quickly find out that my underperforming peer was being assigned better clients and projects while I was being tasked with uphill battles. Not only did Neil start on third base, so any hit would be a home run, he also unknowingly benefited from being taught different rules for the game. Yet, on a certain level, Neil knows that if everyone on his team were just like him, he would fail. Nothing would get done. Visible failures would occur and his job would be on the line. So he depends on people like you with talent and work ethic to make him look good and to do his job so that he can take credit for it, obviously. Of course, he has to hide you in the process. Making your work visible would expose that he doesn't really do anything. On a deeper level, your performance and abilities threaten his ego. He has to believe that he deserves success and that his career advancement is based on merit. But when you're more capable, intelligent, and talented, Neil's inadequacy might be exposed. This is why Neil the Nepo Boss will go out of his way to minimize your visibility, undermine and discredit your work publicly, and even sabotage you. To do that, he might steal some tactics from our next toxic boss. Where do we even start with this one? Because this toxic manager is all up in your business. So let's talk about Janet, the boundaryless boss. We'll start with the most obvious manifestation of her toxicity. She is an extreme micromanager. Janet is the manager who wants to approve every email before you send them. She wants you to talk her through every step that you're about to take in a project before implementing anything. She's the manager who constantly checks on your status on Teams and uses employee monitoring software to spy on you. When you work for Janet, you have no autonomy and no trust. You are constantly questioned, critiqued, and bossed around, which in itself is a massive problem. But what's even worse is that Janet seems to go out of her way to get in yours. She is not a boss who is effective and helps you remove obstacles. She creates them instead. If a project is going along swimmingly, she will come in and cause problems. She will act like a teeny tiny typo will trigger the downfall of a billion-dollar organization. Yet, if you ever approach Janet for help with a problem, which isn't hard to do since she's constantly breathing down your neck, she's not going to help you solve it, but she will make you feel awful and incompetent for not knowing the answer. Spoiler, she doesn't either. Micromanaging bosses are one of the most common type of toxic boss, and it's not just because of their behavior, it's how they keep you constantly on edge. The hypervigilance required to deal with a micromanager is intense. You always have to be ready to give them an update, defend your decisions, and over-communicate your work. The byproduct of this is a whole bunch of toxic boss bad habits that you'll bring into your next job if you don't know what they are and how to get rid of them. Which, FYI, if this is something that you think you might be struggling with, I have a free assessment I created to help you gain insight on how your toxic work experience is affecting you even after you leave your toxic job. You can take it at toxicjobquiz.com. There are a number of boundaries that you need at work in order to maintain a healthy balance and do your best work. Autonomy is one of them. But Janet doesn't stop at invading your autonomy. She likes to stomp on other boundaries as well. Like, she will ask you about your personal life and tell you way too much about hers. Which, if you have a friendly rapport with your boss, I actually think that's cool. A few of my old bosses have become longtime friends and mentors, and I really treasure those relationships. But that's not what we're talking about here. I've had clients whose bosses regularly overshared extremely personal, intimate details about their lives. You know, the kind of information that makes it impossible to look someone in the eye ever again. I've had clients whose boundary-stopping micromanagers demanded that they work excessive hours simply because they didn't want to be alone. Even if Janet respects her personal boundaries, her encroachment into your professional boundaries is going to make the work environment toxic AF. If we were to psychoanalyze Janet, we'd probably reveal that she is a deeply insecure manager. Her micromanagement is driven by distrust, but it's not just distrust in you. Janet has no self-trust, which she projects onto you, which is certainly not a vibe. That said, micromanagers may have intentional and nefarious intent. They may be trying to corrode your confidence at work, and the act of breathing down your neck all day, every day, may be malicious. Dragging you down makes them feel better. Of course, micromanagement is not only used by Janet. Her peers utilize micromanagement as well to control you, break you down, and set you up to fail. Like what we touched on when we were talking about Neil, and we will definitely come back to when we talk about Richard. But there is one toxic boss who does not use micromanagement, which is what makes them so toxic. Because while Janet may be by your side, giving unwanted directions and how to do your job, Miranda will be nowhere to be found. Which, in contrast to Janet, sounds like a dream. Being left to do things on your own is ideal, especially if you are a high autonomy individual like me. Like, almost any level of management is micromanagement for me. But Miranda isn't giving you the room that you need in order to do exceptional work. Miranda is setting you up to fail. When you begin working for Miranda, you quickly realize she's a figure it out on your own type of leader. Even if you go to her with a specific question or problem, asking or begging her for help, she's not going to offer you any support. If you have regular one-on-ones, she's either canceling or no-showing on them often. When you do meet with her, she is uninterested and unengaged, which is why it's unsurprising when it comes to performance management conversations that Miranda has no idea what you do. Miranda also has a habit of giving you directives, but no specifics. Actually, a great example of that is in A Devil Wears Prada, where Miranda Priestley, who obviously inspired the name for this toxic boss type, issues demands to her employees, but if her reports ask for any more information, time and again she refuses. For example,
details of your incompetence do not interest me.
I had a boss like this early in my career. I actually read The Devil Wears Prada for the first time while I was working for him, and I related to it so hard. My boss would give me extremely complex assignments, which I had no exposure to in the first place, let alone understanding of. If I asked a follow-up question, he would literally ignore me, usually leaving me spiraling and begging colleagues and his assistant for help, and typically they had no idea what to do either. So I would try, fail spectacularly, and my boss would give me practical feedback. But this is where he diverged from an actual Miranda, because he would give me feedback. And working from him, I learned how to use failure as an instrument of rapid learning, and for the first time in my life, I got comfortable with not getting it right the first time. And once things were corrected, they were never mentioned again, and nothing was ever held against me. This boss ended up being one of my best advocates and supporters in my career that I ever had. Miranda would never do such a thing because Miranda isn't too busy, distracted, or quite frankly, lacking in interpersonal skills to help you. Miranda wants you to fail. Giving random assignments is just one of the ways that she's going to do that. One of my clients worked for Miranda that would give her impossible to achieve tasks on impossible timelines. It really pissed him off when she was able to make the impossible happen, and then he would up the ante. He started criticizing her publicly in meetings, instructed colleagues not to help her, and assigned her to work way outside the scope of her business area. Think of assigning accounting tasks to a sales rep. The gotcha was she was putting in 100% of her effort to help him succeed. She was actively managing up, supporting his reports who were also being set up to fail just like her, and doing everything in her scope as an executive to set the company up for success. But he only cared about his own success. This is the trademark of this type of toxic boss. They only care about themselves, their success, and their well-being, even if it's against the company's interests. But that also means that occasionally they have to pretend to be a good leader or, have empathy or humanity in order to maintain perception to their boss. They will overcommit their team because the deliverable will make them look good. They will demand excessive work hours because not making metrics would make them look bad, or even worse, miss their bonus. Worst of all, I've heard from several people who have worked with this type of toxic manager who were forced to be dishonest in order to make their boss look good, putting them far out of integrity and ensuring a toxic work environment. Now, I've helped thousands of people get out and over their toxic bosses, and this is probably the most common type that I see. And they're often mixed with the next one. And I'm increasingly hearing about this fourth toxic boss. And I think it's because they're being emboldened by the moment that we're in. I've worked with this type of toxic boss a few times, and I would have been in awe at their level of delusion if it wasn't so destructive. What's the delusion, you ask? Well, the delusion is that they're Don Draper and that we're in the 1960s, when he is most definitely not Don Draper, and we're closer to the 2060s than we are to the 1960s. So let's talk about Ed. The last Ed I worked with personally wasn't my boss, but he was a peer in the senior leadership team within the same org that I sat in. And from the moment that I met him, I knew he was going to be a problem. He was your typical Ed. Loud, full of bravado, and the personification of the Dunning-Kruger effect. He led a team in a traditionally male-dominated business area, and he was definitely the type that was bringing his team to the gentlemen's clubs on his corporate expense account, where I hope their ladies were getting their bag for having to get anywhere near him. He was the type of boss that would constantly ask the only woman on the team to fetch the coffee before the meeting started. The Ed that I worked with made a spectacle because he was directed to consider hiring non-chat candidates. He hired for a role where I guess no chats applied, so he loudly proclaimed, in a company-wide meeting no less, "See, I'm hiring women." Literally, every woman in his organization made complaints about his conduct, and absolutely nothing was done about it. Because of course, when he said something about women, people of color, or really any visible or invisible minority, he was joking, though he never could explain what made the joke funny. Ed is also the type who thinks that the biggest threat to the world is DEI. Well, I think this is often because Neil doesn't know what DEI is. I think on a deeper level, Ed knows that he would be a spectacular failure on a level playing field. He lacks the qualifications, competence, and skill to advance at work without having unfair advantages, and he also has a deeply embedded sense of superiority. Ed is also very committed to corporate hierarchies, and he thinks his job title demands respect. I met one tech founder and CEO who literally said, "I'm a CEO, I deserve respect." Neither of us expected for me to burst into laughter, but that's exactly what happened. And while it was hysterically funny to me, this unhinged position of "you will respect my authority" really causes toxic behaviors at work. In order to assert his power and dominance, Ed assigns work that is basically insulting to your abilities and your intelligence. One of my clients worked for this toxic manager who constantly forced her to complete visible tasks that were at least 2 to 3 grades below her level in order to humiliate her. He would nitpick her work and over time completely corroded her confidence at work. This toxic manager wasn't just doing this for his own delusions and incompetence. There was something much darker at play, which brings us to the 5th type of toxic toxic boss. In my opinion, this is the worst one. Whenever one of my clients is dealing with this toxic manager, my advice is always to get out of there as quickly as possible, because the damage that this toxic boss does will have a profound impact on you that can last years. We'll call this toxic boss Richard because he's a real If you Google Machiavellian, Richard's picture is 100% going to be an image result. Richard has several of the qualities of other toxic managers, but there is one thing that is distinct about Richard. He ruins your day for fun. The damage he does to your career and your psyche isn't a byproduct of his self-obsession, it's his intention. The client that I just mentioned whose toxic manager made a point of humiliating her publicly at work, he did that because he got pleasure from her humiliation. He was obsessed with appearances, but since he's awful, he needed to drag everyone down in order to make himself look better. At best, Richard is narcissistic, brimming with grandiosity, and has a very fragile sense of self. At worst, Richard is in the 20% of corporate leaders who could be diagnosed with mild to moderate psychopathy, which FYI is one of my favorite stats to quote. The worst part is, because Richard centers himself so strongly, everyone else does too, including you. Which is why you've probably already diagnosed Richard's personality disorders, and you know all the stats on the havoc that he is wreaking at work. But what's important is not his bad intentions, it's the impact that it has on you. I've worked with countless people whose lives and careers have been destroyed by a Richard. They've gone years without their confidence, their career, or their compensation recovering. Most people think that having a boss like Richard, or any of the other toxic bosses that we talked about, is something that you should be able to just brush off, which is why it's so confusing when these toxic bosses continue to live in your head rent-free long after you stop working with them. The biggest mistake that people make when they try to recover from working with any of these toxic bosses is they focus on their toxic manager, which is exactly the wrong person. If you want to unpack the toxicity and the chaos that was caused by your toxic manager, go watch this video next because I want to help you get over it for good.